In this drawing, I will again show nearly the full process switching between a normal rate and a rate of half a minute per second. The first section here at actual speed, you'll see, where I begin to make the patterns of parallel lines that read as value called hatching, is about 20 minutes after I started the first discarded thumbnail at top left. The total drawing time here was roughly 2 hours. Hatching value is about systems and layers. It's where you start to spend some of the time you created by developing a more active response. Imagine the terms or process of engagement you've developed with straight line tools and searching lines stretched across planes. The directions of major and minor axes translated into intersecting walls of roughly parallel lines. Hatching doesn't just come at the end the same way blocking or axis don't only happen at the beginning. It's another versatile strategic tool you've already seen me deploy in some earlier drawings, because it's like once you have a full vocabulary, you can't just stop using the words the or. Hatching moves in and out of axis, moves in and out of extension, moves in and out of blocking, moves in and out of grid. Look here at these 2 points of hatching I've begun with. One at upper left moves at an angle up and away to left or down toward center. The other below mid-center moves vertically. They're oppositional, but not opposite. If they cross, they would make a third direction. The biggest mistake beginners make with cross-hatching, oppositional hatching that intersects, is using hatch marks that are totally opposite, meeting at a cross, X, or T shape. If you make that X or plus, it stops all movement in your drawing. So you get more is less instead of less is more. But what I mean is you put together 2 directions and come out with none, because 2 interlocking directions of equal strength cancel out. That's not to say there's no place for it, but you have to know what it does. If you need a place to stop, then it makes some sense. If you need it to act as a flatter instance where you have something that's completely frontal flat plane, it can make sense. Or if you make variation between those 2 intersecting opposite directions so that one is a dominant direction, it becomes more functional. It's important for hatching to enter the drawing early if it's going to play a significant role. You're in a constant adjustment and development of the total form, so if you try to fill it in at the end, there won't be a job for it to fulfill. The hatching comes in while some edges are still ambiguous, while the proposition remains in that blocked in or summary form. Then hatching can be another kind of shape making, another kind of movement, and it's not stuck in a tertiary role. All the drawing actions move from big to small. So just as the blocking in process goes from summary design to summary forms to summary parts to details, so hatching begins more broadly and diffuse, and then lines start to fit between lines. Shapes start being built up inside of shapes. This is where that physicality we've been developing, drawing from the shoulder and the radius of the elbow and wrist, rather than just the fingertips, starts to pay off. To drop in waves of hatching. In order to see and respond to the value pattern of the situation, you need to be able to drop in those rapid straight lines like you're vigorously shaking up some poor jerk's can of pop. Hatching works hand in hand with the straight line tools. You'll see me sometimes draw a shape that corresponds to the value shift, then hatch inside of it. This is a guidepost that allows one to pick out the plane shift, pick out where the form turns, and then apply the direction or directions that fit the form idea. How do you determine the directions? There are a lot of ways to go about it, but I'll give you a few ideas. The problem of directions of hatching that negate one another I mentioned earlier also applies to the relation between hatching and the form. If the form goes one way and the hatching is all the opposite, they'll be hard to pull together. For instance, if you treat the floor or ground plane only with vertical lines, they would appear a mismatch. Uh, when you look at a surface, you have to think about how a line might intersect along that surface. How can it go with some direction of that form? When you see a volumetric form in space, it has more than one direction generally. There is, even in a flat plane, you can say that it has a long edge that goes one direction primarily, shorter edge that goes its other direction, and then maybe from point to point at its corners, it creates other directions. Uh, so as you try to locate the directional forces you want to pick up on, then it makes sense to first think of the hatching having having something to do with movement and visual pathways there. You also want to avoid hatching only in one direction or hatching the same in every direction. Hatching the same in every direction all over the drawing. Our idea of harmony and variety advises against too much the same or all difference. So in hatching, in value pattern, in drawing, you want to develop a hierarchy, and then the complexity of that hierarchy can be built on. If you have the hatching line all truly going a single direction on the drawing, then your drawing is overpowered by sliding that one direction. Uh, Hierarchy is the order of importance, like a main direction, a secondary direction, and then a subordinate direction. You can benefit early on from setting a simple rule, I think. Say hatching at a 30-degree angle to the direction of the form you observe. Then you have to ask yourself, what is the main direction and what is maybe the next most prominent? If your source has a good hierarchy, if the subject you see has a good hierarchy of different shapes and sizes in an interesting balance of unequal parts, then this approach will be informed by that, and you'll have the ability to imbue that hierarchy into the hatching structure without having to move much outside of this idea of a 30-degree angle to the main direction observed in the movement of each form and place in space. If you look at what I'm doing here, it has something like that kind of process, or at least it began from that. Notice how the two directions that I noted at the early stage of the video are still playing a big role here. Much of the most effective cross-hatching and hatching comes from angles that change only a few degrees. You'll see that as the form turns or as an element angles into the distance, I'll turn the hatching slightly or turn it as it moves up to an edge. This turns the form and at the same time makes it easier for me to move established edges late in the drawing. I think that drawing is not great at declaratives. You can make a drawing of the thing you love most in the world, or the hat of your favorite team, the pearls of your great aunt, but it won't read in the construct of the drawing. It won't be imbued with that. It doesn't work so well to simply make the statement. Drawings are good for analogy, of saying this is like that or this is different from that. I make the top of the drawing soft, slow, and detailed by, of course, building it up with more information. You can see me continue to add layers of hatching that begin to delineate more particular folds in that cloth, a greater sense of how one moves across that surface. These things start to make that appear more delicate and more like that undulating form. But you'll see as it brings into focus some of what's happening below it, is that it's also made soft, and it's also made, slower and more detailed by making the bottom foreground more harsh, more loose, and left at a more summary stage. Uh, you respond to and you create hierarchies. And learning to see form has to do with learning to develop these less declarative, more ambiguous meanings. So in your drawing, if you get stuck on the thing, if you get stuck on what it is, the thingness of it, the declarative, it can help to move your internal dialogue to that dual form, that double meaning. Forget about the drawing, the drapery, or the shadow, and think about visual grouping. What are you tying together and how? Groups of hatching obviously group together. Which group more and which group less? Among those, what shapes of hatching group with others they aren't attached to on some other position in the page because they're going the same direction, or they group because they're similar lightness or darkness, or they form shapes of similar size, or they're made up of similar line weights or characters, or they're flat and others transition. It can become more interesting to group across the form, to group across the page, to group lines with shape, to group positive shapes with negative shapes, to group near with far? Or do you need to keep the foreground group near and together and group the background all with itself? This is a decision of spatial form versus the flat design. And then again, light has mood and direction has speed. So you have a lot to juggle.